When we pulled into the driveway, I already hated the siding. Peeling paint, a crooked porch light, and those dusty plastic flowers still hanging by the mailbox like some kind of sad joke. It was the kind of house that looked like it remembered everything. And I didn't want to remember anything. Travis killed the engine like he was home. He was. I wasn't. I hadn't been asked, just told. "It's temporary," he said, weeks before, sitting on the edge of our bed while I packed up my job, my apartment, my actual life, just until we sort out family stuff. Translation. My mom's in rehab, and I need someone to play wife while I go through boxes and pretend I'm being noble. His little brother Jake was already there, standing in the doorway like he'd been waiting. Taller than I expected, lean, dark, hair messy in a way that wasn't accidental. He nodded at me. No grin, no judgment. Just this look, not intense, not flirty. Just like he saw me, like he already knew something about me I hadn't figured out myself. That freaked me out more than I let on. "Jake," Travis called out, throwing the car keys toward him like they were in some kind of team sport. "Help unload the trunk?" He didn't move. Travis rolled his eyes and walked inside, already on his phone. I stood there a second, unsure whether to follow or scream. Jake stepped off the porch. "I can take your bag," he said. Quiet voice. Not shy, just deliberate. "I got it," I said, sharper than I meant to. He didn't flinch. Inside, the house smelled like hand sanitizer and old carpet. Photos lined the hallway. Travis at 10, at prom, at graduation. His mom everywhere, her lipstick always one shade too red, a ghost of a woman even before rehab. The air felt like it hadn't been touched in years. Travis had disappeared into what used to be his room. I stood in the living room holding a box labeled Books plus Misc, wondering where I was supposed to go. Jake passed by me again, heading to the kitchen, and I caught him glancing at the wall, at the photos, at me. "You'll get used to it," he said, not looking back. That night, I cooked. Not because I wanted to, because no one else did. Travis was on a Zoom call, pacing the porch, talking mergers. Jake stayed out in the garage, doing something that involved clanging metal and old Nirvana albums. I didn't ask. I set 3 plates. Only 2 got used. After dinner, I went to shower. I came out and heard Travis in the bedroom, FaceTiming someone. His mom, I assumed. I paused outside the door when I heard my name. "She's fine. Just lost," he said. A pause. "Spoiled, honestly. I think this might be good for her. Good for me." I walked back down the hall, past the family photos, past the one where Travis was, 6 and missing a front tooth. I sat on the back steps with a warm drink Jake must have left there earlier. I didn't even drink. But I took a sip. Behind me, the screen door creaked. Jake didn't say anything. Just stood there with his arms crossed, watching the yard like he owned it. "You don't talk much," I said, without turning. "Neither do you," he replied. I looked up at the sky, dull and cloudy, not a single star in sight. "Feels like this place forgot how to breathe," I said. Jake stepped down beside me, not too close, not too far. Just enough that I could smell the motor oil on his shirt. He didn't answer. But he nodded, like he agreed. Like he'd been holding his breath, too. And that, somehow, felt like the first true thing that had happened all day. By the end of the first week, I stopped checking the calendar. The days blended together. Grocery runs, laundry, half-finished conversations, and that quiet hum of being somewhere you don't belong but can't leave. The house had this weird way of making everything feel slower, like even time didn't want to move forward here. Travis worked from the converted sunroom, door closed, headset on, occasionally yelling numbers at people I'd never meet. He was good at sounding important, less good at noticing the dishes piling up or the fact that I hadn't been sleeping. If I said something, he'd nod and say we'd find a rhythm soon. But the truth was, he already had one. I was the one playing catch up in someone else's routine. Jake spent most of his time in the garage, elbows deep in some rusty motorcycle that hadn't run in probably 10 years. Every time I passed by, the door was cracked open just enough to hear music playing. Mostly old rock, some blues, never anything new. Once I caught myself standing there, just listening. I didn't knock. I didn't go in. But something about that room, or maybe just him, felt more awake than the rest of the house. The only time Jake and I really crossed paths was early morning. He'd be in the kitchen making black coffee like it was a ritual, and I'd be pretending to care about toast or oatmeal. He never asked questions, never filled the space with fake politeness. He just made dry comments like, "You ever plan on actually sitting down while you eat?" Or, "You organizing the pantry for fun?" Or just existential dread? And somehow, that sarcasm felt more human than anything Travis had said all week. One morning, I cracked a joke back, something dumb about his ridiculous coffee mug. It had a cartoon chicken lifting weights. And he actually laughed, not a loud one, but real. I realized how long it had been since I heard that sound in this house. There was the same day Travis decided to leave for Houston without telling me until he was already halfway there. "Last-minute client meeting," he said through the car speaker. "You'll be fine, babe. Take some time for yourself." He hung up before I could ask where he left the groceries I'd asked him to pick up. I walked out to the garage a few hours later just to be somewhere else. I didn't even plan on talking. I ended up crying instead. I sat down on an overturned bucket behind a shelf of dusty paint cans and just broke. Not loud, not dramatic. Just that slow, steady kind of crying where you realize you're not sure when it started or when it's going to stop. I didn't think Jake saw me. He didn't say anything. He didn't offer comfort or make a joke. He just turned the volume down on the radio and kept working like nothing happened. Later that night, I found a cold drink on the kitchen table with a folded napkin under it. 3 words, scribbled in black pen. "You deserve quiet." Then underneath, smaller. Not explanations. I stared at it longer than I should have. It was the first thing anyone had given me in weeks that didn't ask for anything in return. The next day, while reorganizing a drawer in the guest room, my version of avoiding myself, I found a photo. It was in a beat-up shoebox under a stack of high school yearbooks and Christmas cards. A girl, leaning against a truck. Wind-blown hair, crooked smile. She looked like me. Not exactly, but enough that it hit something in my chest. I turned the photo over. Jake's messy handwriting. No date, just a name I didn't recognize in one sentence. She left before it got quiet. I put the picture back and didn't tell anyone I found it. Not even him. I just went outside and stood on the porch until the sun started to drop behind the trees. And for the first time in days, I let myself wonder what it would feel like to leave. Not for a day, not for a breather, but for real. Jake passed me on his way inside. He didn't stop. But he looked at me long enough to let me know he knew I was thinking it. And for a second, it felt like maybe that was enough. It started with pasta, like a lot of bad decisions probably do. Jake had found some old box of penny in the pantry and a jar of red chili flakes that should have expired. But he didn't seem to care, and neither did I. Travis was still in Houston, maybe in a hotel, maybe not alone, maybe not thinking about me at all. And the house had slipped into this strange rhythm without him, like it could finally exhale. Jake didn't ask if I wanted dinner. He just cooked like it was a given, like I was already part of whatever small, quiet world he'd built for himself between grease-stained shop rags and half-fixed machines. He didn't talk much while he worked, just moved through the kitchen with this casual focus that made me feel like I didn't need to fill the silence with anything. When he handed me a bowl, he grinned for half a second, barely, and said, "Don't cry when your mouth catches fire." I rolled my eyes and told him I could handle heat. I was wrong. One bite in and my face lit up like a bonfire. He laughed so hard he almost dropped his fork, and for once, I didn't feel like I was being laughed at. After dinner, we ended up on the couch watching some grainy old movie he said his mom used to love. Black and white, barely audible, full of long pauses and glances that meant more than dialogue. Somewhere in the middle, his leg brushed against mine, just barely, like gravity had given up pretending it wasn't pulling us closer. I should have shifted. I should have moved. I didn't. He didn't either. Neither of us said anything. But the movie got harder to follow after that. I must have fallen asleep. I woke up hours later under his jacket, the soft kind that always smelled like cold air and gasoline. The TV was off. The room was quiet. I folded the jacket neatly, left it on the back of the couch, and walked down the hall to the room I technically shared with a man who hadn't texted me goodnight in 3 days. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at the ceiling for what felt like forever. The next afternoon, Jake asked if I wanted to go with him to pick up parts from some dusty auto supply shop 30 miles out. I said yes before I thought about it. The truck smelled like him. Not cologne, not soap, but something human, something grounded. We didn't talk much at first. Windows down, wind loud, music low. He let me choose the playlist and didn't say a word when I landed on something moody from a playlist I hadn't touched in years. He just tapped the steering wheel in time with the beat and drove like the road was familiar, but the company wasn't. We stopped at a rundown gas station with flickering fluorescent lights and a coffee machine that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the early 2000s. He poured 2 cups anyway, handed me one without asking how I take it. It was bitter and burnt, but warm. We sat on the hood of his truck like 2 people who didn't need to explain why they weren't somewhere else. Out of nowhere, he said, "You're not at all who he said you were." I looked over at him, expecting some smug smirk or joke to follow, but he just stared straight ahead at the empty road, jaw tight, eyes unreadable. I opened my mouth to respond and didn't. I just nodded, because I didn't know who I was either anymore. On the way back, he played a song I couldn't place at first. Something soft, familiar. Then I remembered I'd posted it years ago, one of those songs you share when you're trying to say something without saying it. I looked at him, and he didn't look back. Just kept driving, like the road ahead was easier to deal with than whatever was happening inside the cab. I wanted to ask him why he remembered that song. I wanted to ask what else he remembered. But instead, I watched the trees blur past the window and realized that sometimes the smallest moments are the ones that split everything wide open. And once they split, you can't go back to pretending. Nothing cracked. It was around 2 in the morning when I gave up on sleep. The house was still, the kind of still that hums in your bones, and the fan above our bed clicked with an uneven rhythm that made it impossible to ignore how wide the space between me and Travis had become. He was knocked out cold beside me, one arm flopped across the sheets like he owned the silence. I slipped out without bothering to be quiet. The backyard was cold in that spring in Texas way. Damp air, grass slick under bare feet, and mosquitoes already awake. I sat on the steps and lit a candle I'd found in a drawer earlier that week. Vanilla and something chemical. I held it like it was doing something useful. Jake was already out there, half in the shadows, leaning against the fence with a filter, between his fingers. He didn't look surprised to see me. Didn't speak. Just nodded once like we were on the same page without even having to open the book. He walked over slowly, not in any kind of dramatic way, just like he didn't see a reason to rush anything. He held out the filter. I stared at it for a second, then took it, even though I didn't smoke, never had. I didn't put it to my mouth, just held it, like maybe pretending was enough tonight. He looked at me then, not with any kind of intensity. Not like he was trying to make a moment, just honest, sharp, and heavy in the way most people avoid. Then he said, "You smile when he ignores you. That's the scariest thing I've ever seen." I didn't have anything to say to that. No defense, no lie. I looked away, but he didn't stop staring. For a second, I thought he was going to reach for me. His hand twitched like it might, but he didn't. Instead, I moved. Not out of impulse, not out of loneliness, but because everything in my body had been leaning toward this for days, maybe longer, and pretending otherwise suddenly felt more like a betrayal than the kiss itself. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't some messy, breathless thing. It was slow, steady, like a held note in a quiet room. No fumbling, no grabbing, no pressure. Just lips against lips, skin warmed from shared breath, and the kind of silence that says everything without needing to ask for meaning. I pulled back first, not because I regretted it, but because I wasn't ready to let it become something. Not yet. Jake didn't say anything, just nodded once like he knew I was going to stop it. Then he turned around and walked back inside. I stayed out for another 10 minutes, maybe 20, trying to figure out if I was supposed to feel guilty, or if it was worse that I didn't. When I climbed back into bed, Travis shifted and pulled me, close like he could sense something but didn't care enough to ask. I let him. I let his hand rest on my hip. I let the lie sit heavy between us. I let myself shut down. We were together that night. The kind that feels like muscle memory. Quiet, automatic, forgettable. After, he fell asleep immediately. I stared at the ceiling and thought about how soft Jake's mouth was. I thought about how he didn't grab or push or ask for more. I thought about how he didn't need me to be anything. In the morning, Jake didn't look at me. He poured his coffee, leaned against the counter, and stared at the backyard like last night never happened. Travis brought me flowers. White lilies. Huge, waxy, over-perfumed things. The kind you put in hospitals or at funerals. He smiled, like he'd done something sweet, like I'd be grateful. He didn't remember that I told him, a year ago, I hated lilies. I hated the way they stunk up a room. I hated how they reminded me of endings. I said thank you anyway. Because that's what you do when the lie gets too familiar to fight. The days after the kiss felt like someone had pulled the sound out of the house and left everything else intact. The ticking of the hallway clock, the hum of the fridge, the soft thud of Jake's boots outside the garage. But under it all, there was this sharp, invisible tension, something electric and unfinished. Jake didn't speak to me unless it was necessary, and even then, his words came out clipped, almost mechanical, like he was carefully measuring how much space he could afford to take up around me without cracking open something we both weren't ready to name. Travis, on the other hand, had never been chattier. He was energized in this vaguely manic way, suddenly full of ideas about staying longer and making the place work. He started talking like he'd already decided we were planting roots here, repainting the porch, maybe fixing up his mom's old room, building something. I don't think he noticed that I didn't respond most of the time. I'd just nod, smile when expected, and keep my hands busy, folding clothes, rearranging drawers, doing whatever it took to keep myself from looking too long in Jake's direction. 1. Mourning over burnt eggs, Travis announced that maybe we should look into refinancing the house. Make it more permanent, he said with a grin, like permanence was a prize. I stirred my coffee and asked if he'd talked to his mom about that, knowing damn well she was barely lucid half the time. He waved me off, already planning aloud. Jake didn't even look up from his bowl of cereal. When Travis left for a quick meeting at a nearby co-working space, I sat there a moment longer, chewing the inside of my cheek, staring at Jake like maybe he'd say something. Anything. Instead, he picked up his bowl, rinsed it in the sink, and without looking at me said, "You're not gonna leave him." No judgment, no anger. Just a flat truth, delivered like a diagnosis. I wanted to argue. I wanted to say he didn't know me, but I couldn't find a single word that didn't sound fake. So I just sat there and let him walk out the back door, the screen slapping shut behind him harder than usual. It rained that afternoon, one of those cold, soaking spring rains that makes everything gray for hours. I waited 2 hours, then 3. Pacing the kitchen, checking the garage, calling Jake's name like a question I already knew the answer to. His bike was still there, his jacket still hung over the banister, but he wasn't anywhere in the house. Eventually, I found him sitting, at the bus stop down the road, drenched, elbows on his knees, head low. He didn't look surprised to see me. Didn't even glance over when I pulled up in the car and opened the door. He sat there like getting in would cost him something he didn't have left. I didn't say anything either, just left the door open and waited. After a minute, he climbed in, soaked through, water pooling under his feet on the floor mat. We didn't speak the whole drive back. I turned off the radio. Even the windshield wipers felt too loud. When we got back to the house, I handed him a towel and went to change into dry clothes. By the time I came out, he was back in the garage, acting like nothing happened, like he hadn't just sat in the rain for hours because being near me in that house had become too loud to bear. Later that night, I found Travis in the living room, posting a picture of us from last year. Me in a white dress, him in some overpriced suit, both of us smiling like we hadn't already started falling apart. The caption said, "Blessed." I didn't ask why. He didn't offer a reason. He kissed me on the forehead like we were still pretending well enough, and then went back to his emails. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after he went to bed, drinking lukewarm tea I didn't want, staring out the window at the dark backyard, wondering if Jake was out there, staring up at the same sky, waiting for me to move, and knowing I wouldn't. Travis's sister Andrea arrived on a Saturday morning like a storm with perfect hair. Heels clicking across the porch, sunglasses still on despite the overcast sky, perfume trailing behind her, like it was meant to overwrite the smell of stale coffee and resentment that had settled into the house. She hugged me like she'd missed me, like we had history, but her grip was tight and her cheek barely touched mine. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and her eyes didn't blink nearly enough. Jake didn't come in from the garage until after she'd made a show of unpacking 3 bottles of overpriced wine and a half-eaten pastry from some boutique bakery in downtown Austin. When he walked into the kitchen, she looked him up and down like she was trying to see whether he still fit the version of him she'd kept in her head all these years. He didn't. He looked older, sharper, more grounded in his own mess. She raised her eyebrows at him, then poured a glass of wine before noon without asking anyone if they wanted any. The tension was instant. Not loud, not dramatic, but laced into every word like bitterness stirred into tea. Subtle but impossible to miss if you knew the taste. Andrea talked a lot, mostly about her new job, her new boyfriend, her recent trip to Greece. Jake listened. Without looking at her, arms crossed, leaning against the doorframe like he didn't owe this house, or her, anything. At one point, she turned to him and said, "You still chasing dead things out there in that garage?" He didn't answer, just shrugged and walked out, taking his drink with him. Later, while Travis ran out to pick up steaks for a proper family dinner, Andrea cornered me in the kitchen with the casual cruelty of someone who didn't think twice, about hitting a bruise just to see if it still hurt. She leaned in like she was sharing a secret and said, "You know, you should probably stop looking at Jake like that. People talk." I froze, not because she was wrong, but because she was right. And the worst part was that she was talking, and I wasn't surprised. I tried to walk past her, but she stepped in front of me, lowering her voice. "I don't blame you. Travis has always needed a mirror more than a partner. He wants applause, not intimacy." I didn't respond. I didn't owe her the satisfaction. Then, just as I thought the conversation was over, she added softly, "He's always been unfaithful, by the way. That's not new. The only thing that changed was whether you were willing to notice." She walked out of the kitchen like she'd just handed me a gift. I stood there, hands gripping the edge of the counter, hearing her heels click away, trying to decide if it was worse that she might be lying or that she probably wasn't. That night, Travis left for San Antonio. "Just for a couple of nights," he said, barely looking up from his phone. "Quick thing with a client. Won't be long." He kissed me on the cheek like I was furniture and walked out the door without waiting for a goodbye. What he didn't realize was that his phone was still on the table. I stared at it for a while. I didn't want to be the kind of person who snooped, who searched, who needed proof of what she already felt in her gut. But I picked it up anyway, the way people press on bruises, just to see how bad it really is. The messages were there. 2 different women, one named Alyssa, one saved only as C. The texts weren't poetic. They were careless, thoughtless, half-effort attempts at connection wrapped in emojis and half-promises. One message read, "My wife's sweet, but honestly boring. As heck." Another said, "She's good at playing house. That's about it." I closed the phone. I didn't cry. I didn't throw it or delete anything. I just put it back exactly where he left it. That night, I went to the garage, not for confrontation, not even for comfort. Jake was there, sitting on the floor, legs stretched out, drink in hand. I didn't ask him to talk. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I just sat down beside him, took the bottle from his hand, drank, and waited for the buzz to catch up to the ache in my chest. After a while, he looked at me. Really looked, like he'd been holding back for weeks and suddenly couldn't anymore, and asked, "You want to hurt him, or just feel like you're alive again?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because the moment I leaned into him, the moment our mouths found each other in the dark space between guilt and hunger, I already knew the answer. This time, it didn't stop at a kiss. And this time, I didn't pretend it wasn't exactly what I wanted. By the time the sun came up, I had already rehearsed a dozen versions of the morning. In some of them, I snuck out of the garage quietly, back into the house, showered, made breakfast, and pretended like nothing had happened. In others, I stayed in that dimly lit room with Jake, letting the silence between us stretch until it cracked open something real, until we had no choice but to acknowledge what we'd done. But none of those versions happened. What did happen was simpler, colder, and far more complicated. We didn't say a single word after it was over. Not one. He handed me his sweatshirt when I shivered. I pulled it on without looking at him. He stayed on the floor, back against the tool bench, staring straight ahead like he was waiting for a sign that wouldn't come. I stood up, barefoot on concrete, and left the room without glancing back. In the kitchen, I washed my hands twice, even though they weren't dirty. The smell of motor oil still clung to my skin, and I couldn't decide if I wanted it to stay or disappear. Completely. Upstairs, I found Travis's side of the bed empty, his suitcase still gone, his shaving kit untouched. I climbed into the cold sheets anyway and laid there for 2 hours, eyes open, body motionless, the sweatshirt still pressed to my chest. The next few days passed like a movie that had been muted, scenes flickering by with no sound, no rhythm, just a blur of half-eaten meals, skipped conversations, and glances that meant too much or nothing at all. I played the role I'd built, for myself with robotic efficiency. Wife, cook, errand runner, house sitter. I did the laundry, kept the place tidy, answered Travis's texts with little thumbs-up emojis and sounds good replies. He didn't ask for anything more. Jake and I barely spoke. When we crossed paths in the hallway, his eyes would drop, mine would flick away, and the weight of what we weren't saying followed us from room to room like a shadow we didn't invite but couldn't shake. It was unbearable and, somehow, also familiar. The ache of pretending you don't need what you already tasted. One night, I finally cracked. Not with a scream, not with a dramatic confession, but with a simple sentence I threw out like a dare. Travis was eating dinner, fork in one hand, phone in the other. I sat across from him, elbows on the table, staring at the plate I had no intention of finishing. Without looking up, I said, "I need to get away for a bit. Just a week. Maybe stay with Amanda." I didn't even know if Amanda would say yes. I just needed something that sounded like freedom. Travis didn't miss a beat. He scrolled through his phone and replied, "Sure. Just leave a list for the grocery run. You know I always forget the brand you like." I watched him laugh at something, on his screen, probably a meme, and realized he hadn't even registered the fact that I was trying to leave him. It didn't occur to him that I needed a break from him. I could have said I was flying to Paris and he would have told me to pack warm socks. I didn't leave. I packed a small bag and kept it in the closet, but I never got in the car. Instead, I stayed. Up late again that night and wandered into Jake's room when the house was quiet enough to feel honest. He didn't look surprised to see me. He didn't ask me to leave. We didn't speak at all, just folded into each other with the desperation of people trying to steal seconds from something doomed. The next morning, over a cold piece of toast and lukewarm coffee, he looked up at me with bloodshot eyes and said, "I'm falling for a woman who disappears before sunrise. You know how messed up that is?" I didn't respond. I didn't have the right. He finished his coffee, stood up without pushing in his chair, and left the house like he had somewhere to be, even though I knew he didn't. I sat there at the kitchen table for almost an hour after he was gone, fingers wrapped around an empty mug, stomach hollow, wondering if this was what limbo felt like. Not pain, not love, just the slow suffocation of waiting for something you know won't come. And the worst part? I still didn't leave. Andrea decided we were all overdue for a proper family gathering. She called it a brunch, but it was more like a forced performance. Mismatched chairs pulled around the backyard table, mimosas poured before noon, everyone dressed like they hadn't been silently at war for the past 2 weeks. She brought friends. From the city, loud and polished, the kind of people who spoke in curated anecdotes and smiled with too many teeth. Travis loved it. He thrived in rooms full of people who didn't know him well enough to question him. I wore a dress I didn't remember, packing, one I hadn't worn since we lived in Dallas, back when Travis still noticed the way I did my hair. He kissed my cheek in front of everyone like we were fine, like he wasn't still sleeping on the far side of the bed, body turned away, dreaming about other women whose names I now knew. Jake hovered in the background most of the time, shirt slightly, wrinkled, jaw tight, eyes scanning the group like he was bracing for something to break. I avoided him. Not because I wanted to, because I had to. The air between us was charged, and we both knew one wrong glance would say everything we'd worked so hard to bury. Then she showed up, one of the women from Travis's messages. Not Alyssa, the other one. The one saved as C. She introduced herself as Claire, kissed Andrea's cheek like they were old friends, and sat down at the table across from me like this was a coincidence. It wasn't. Her eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to see it. Not guilt, not shame, just quiet satisfaction. She knew I knew. And worse, she knew I wouldn't do anything. Travis didn't flinch, not when she arrived. Not when she laughed too hard at his stories. Not when her fingers brushed his sleeve and stayed there just a little too long. He leaned into it, just enough to let me know that if I wanted to react, I'd be the one disrupting the performance. Excused myself halfway through the meal. No speech, no dramatics. Just stood up, walked around the side of the house, and kept walking until I hit the edge of the lot where the trees started to swallow the sky. Jake followed me. I heard the crunch of gravel, his steps faster than usual, like he wasn't sure if I'd keep going and disappear entirely. When he caught up, I didn't turn around. I just said, "She's one of them." He didn't ask who I meant. He didn't pretend not to know. "I figured," he said, voice low. "I saw her around once. Didn't think she'd be bold enough to show up here." I turned. To him then, really turned, and all the restraint I'd been clinging to slipped through my fingers like water. "You knew and didn't tell me?" Jake's jaw clenched. "You knew. You just needed someone else to say it out loud." I wanted to hit him and hold him in the same breath. I wanted someone to blame and someone to keep me from collapsing. I stepped closer without realizing I was moving. "I hate this," I said. "I hate him. I hate her. I hate me for staying." Jake looked at me like he was trying not to, like he'd promised himself not to make this worse, not to make it messier. But then his hand brushed my wrist and everything in me folded. When I came home, Travis was sitting on the couch, scrolling. Through his phone, wine glass balanced on his knee. He looked up once, said, "Everything okay?" I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Yeah." He smiled, lifted his glass, and said, "Good. Didn't want to deal with drama tonight." That was the moment. I understood, not just that he knew, but that he didn't care. As long as I played my part, as long as I stood next to him and wore the mask, he'd pretend too. That night, he didn't come to bed. I didn't ask where he went, and the silence between us became the only language we both spoke fluently. Jake told me he was leaving on a Thursday. No build-up, no speech, just stood in the garage with a wrench in one hand and said, "I got a call. Friend of mine's doing contract work in Arizona. Said he could use an extra pair of hands." He didn't look at me when he said it, just kept tightening some bolt on that damn bike he never finished. It felt like a script he'd rehearsed in his head for days, and now that it was out, he was determined not to revise a word of it. I leaned against the frame of the open door, arms crossed, chest tight in that way that feels like anger, but is probably fear dressed up in heavier clothes. "So that's it?" I asked, not really knowing what kind of answer I expected. He wiped his hands on a rag and finally looked up. "You knew I wasn't staying. You've always known that." I opened my mouth to argue, but